Joining us now, Glenn Davis, member of the House of Delegates in Virginia, Republican Virginia Beach, small business owner, understands small business probably better than anybody else in there, and he's joining us now. Good to have you with us, Glenn.
John, thanks for having me on.
Glenn, so just as the General Assembly was ending, all hell breaks loose. So I want to get to the coronavirus in Virginia now, then we'll go back and do a recap. The governor today, on Friday, closing schools 2 weeks today, banning gatherings over 100. Where are we in Virginia with this? What have you heard?
Well, I mean, John, obviously we're seeing exponential growth, as everyone expected, with regards to the coronavirus. Those more elderly or with other health conditions are more at risk. However, those that are young that are not necessarily in that grouping for the mortality sector still need to understand that they can be a carrier of this virus, and by giving it to someone who's more elderly puts them at significant risk. I've been really impressed, John, by Virginians and by Americans, the way our governors handled this, the way our presidents handled this. We've gone down a path of moving things forward, doing things to help provide support for Virginians and Americans, and not have people get start to panic. So I've been very supportive. I'm not a doctor, but our governor and our Secretary of Health are. Our president has tremendous doctors around him, and I think we're doing a very good job from what I've seen.
When the governor limits or outlaws, whatever you want, word you want to say, gatherings over 100 for the next 2 or 3 weeks, I forget. I don't know time for me. As I think that makes sense. School closed 2 weeks, but the CDC saying no gatherings over 50 for social distance for 8 weeks. Don't you think that's going to be the end of the 2020 spring school in Virginia?
I think so. This is where I think Virginia's missed a huge opportunity, and we've had, Mark Cole, I think, put a post out about this, and he's right. We've talked about, online learning, virtual learning in Virginia for a long time, and the VEA has been pushing back, and the teacher unions have been pushing back. This is why we push. In business, we talk about things like black swan events. They're events that you could never imagine in a million years ever occurring that impacts your business. John, this is not a black swan event. This is not something that the government should never have thought, hey, this couldn't happen. And virtual learning allows us to prepare for this. We should have been prepared. I do think that we're going to see a lot of online virtual type education for the next 2 to 4 weeks, if not a full 8. And but I do think that the schools are dedicated to making sure that our students still continue to get the education as much as possible through this process as they would in the classroom. And then I would hope come General Assembly session next year that some people take a little bit more of a serious look at virtual and online learning, if not for students full time, at least for situations like this.
All right, tell me about small businesses and the impact on small businesses and what you recommend as a small business owner and an advocate for business in Virginia.
John, they're right behind the health of us as Americans and Virginians. That is important to maintain is the health of our small businesses. If the recovery of our state and our nation depends on the small business when this pandemic is over, and it's going to be a tough one. I love what Mark Cuban did. I think just yesterday with a company called Civic Society, where they're actually paying or they're reimbursing all their employees that are staying home working for all their lunches and coffees that they order out or go through pickup and get from other local small businesses to help those small businesses. I think we all, we need to come together as a community and remember that, at the end of the day, we need to have these small businesses, out there and productive and still in business, because that's where the jobs are. I think a lot of the small businesses are entrepreneurial. I think they're going to shift. I think you're going to see a lot of restaurants can go more to, we can deliver to you. If you look at DoorDash and StubHub, they're starting to offer contactless delivery of local small business and restaurants, which I think is great. And I think you're going to see a little bit more of that. I think you're going to see some changes in some of the business models, and hopefully that's successful because this is going to hit the small businesses hard. And I think what the president has done on the backside as far as providing loans and that sort of thing, I think it's going to be a tremendous help as well.
Well, listen, I just had Steve Bannon on. He recommended that the Congress and the president go through with a pretty significant financial stimulus for small businesses, which I agree with. And he said, basically said, look, we have this huge debt right now. We got to solve the crisis. Then we can deal with that. Zero interest right now. Opportunity for people to pay less money on their credit cards. But, Glenn, as small business owners, we both know that the lifeblood of any small business is cash flow, liquidity, credit. Once those things dry up, it's over. You can't meet payroll, and then that's the end of the company, right? I mean, if there's anybody that understands that, it's me, if you know my history. So you need the liquidity, because if you can borrow in the short term and it's 8 or 10 weeks, you can get past it. You don't have the liquidity. Basically, the day you can't meet payroll, your doors are closed, right? It's over. Yep. You can't get back. Is there any special role the state government could play in that, Glenn?
I think so. So we have a small business finance authority, John, and what I like about our small business finance authority is in some cases it directly gets involved with loans with small businesses and takes the banks out of the equation. Mm-hmm. I applaud the federal government for their talks about loans to small businesses, but I've tried to work through the SBA route and other routes with banks in the past and seen others try to do this for these programs, and it's just as much of a pain in the rear end as trying to get a regular loan, and if you don't have collateral, you still end up in trouble. And banks are notorious for looking at balance sheets and profit and loss and not the actual model of a business. So I think there is a place for Virginia to do it better than the federal government. If the feds would loosen up and provide, like you said, that zero interest money to a state for the state to administer to the small business. In Virginia, we have got that small business finance authority that I think could do it a lot better than banks could and be a lot more efficient with it.
Hey, that's a great idea, Glenn. Why don't you call the governor and maybe you guys get a special session for a day or whatever you call those things and try to implement that, because that makes a lot of sense. Because you're right. At the end of the day, when you have to go through a bank, you have to go through a bank. If you go through a state-run organization and you understand the need there, that's a lot better. Because I can just think about in where we live in Virginia Beach. I mean, you got spring break coming up. How many of those small retailers right along the ocean front, right along the boulevard, I mean, how many of those depend on like a 20, 30% of their annual income is spring break? I mean, you take that out, what happens? We all think this is going to be over by the summer and the beaches will be full and you can perhaps make it up. But in the short term, right, you're a lot of these businesses are leveraged now, waiting for the spring break income to come in, and then they pay their debt, and then they get to the summer, and then they make their money and they get through the winter, right? That's the way it works.
That is. Well, and John, look at the supply chain, right? So you've got a retailer who, maybe is making, ends meet, small business. Right now, people are coming in their store to buy stuff. They've got inventory probably on net 30 terms. And the person they bought that inventory from, that wholesaler, could be a small business in North Carolina, pick a state, or maybe even Virginia. They need to get paid. They're used to getting paid on net 30. That wholesaler now realizes they can't come after the retailer. And so it's just this domino effect going backwards. Right. If we provide this Band-Aid in the middle, that helps tremendously. And talk about payroll, John. I mean, I love the Democrats when they talk about if we had only passed this mandatory 12-week sick leave time, we'd be good and our employees would be taken care of. No, they wouldn't. Where do you think the small business is going to get the money to pay for this from?
It's moronic.
You can't just say,
it's so moronic.
It, really
it is so stupid. Glenn Davis, I knew I wanted to have you on today because you own a business, right? And I own a business. And that is the stupidest thing I've heard. Every time they kept saying that, like Biden last night, everybody's going to get paid. We're going to keep everybody whole. How the hell are you going to do that? I mean, if the businesses don't have the cash to meet payroll, how are you going to give people 13 weeks off and pay them when you don't have any business coming in the door? How do you do that?
Exactly. Shelley, my wife, is sitting next to me last night during the debates saying exactly that. And I'm just thinking, this is what someone who's never run a business in their life says, because they just don't get it. And honestly, I spent a lot of time during this General Assembly session thinking the exact thing with a number of these bills coming through. I mean, we got a tough economic time right now for small businesses, and when we hit recovery, they're going to get just pounded with this new legislation.
Unbelievable. We're with Glenn Davis, Republican House of Delegates member, Virginia Beach. Let's talk about the session. Now it's over. What was your overall take? Give me the Glenn Davis recap special.
John, it was a tough session, not just because of the legislation that passed, but to sit there during session knowing that and being a part of a committee, seeing what you know is very bad legislation coming through, and you can't do a thing about it, made it very hard. Whether it was extremely poorly written firearm legislation that passed out, or whether it was extremely poor business legislation that's going to put more costs and burdens on the back of our small business owners, it was just crazy to see some of this stuff come flying out of the House, John. The Senate was able to, backstop some of it and get rid of some, but there's going to be a lot of stuff that we're not going to be able to fix for a long time to come.
I know, right? The caucus of the corn. I mean, let's just give us a little insight in, you came into the House, you were in the mm-hmm. majority, right? You ran for lieutenant governor. By the way, mm-hmm. I will always remember your race. I thought it was so neat with the mellow yellow van. But now you're going to minority, and there's caucus of the corn. And tell me the biggest difference.
So the biggest difference, well, a couple things. First off, just efficiency of the committees themselves. And this isn't a slight necessarily on the Democratic caucus, but keep in mind that, over half their caucus is new over the last 4 years, right? I mean, they had subcommittee chairs that had only been there for 2 years. Some of them hit the ground running as a chair, like Van Valkenburg, I thought did a tremendous job, and he's only been there a couple of years. But with many others, and understandably so, there was a huge learning curve. So I think that was, kind of got in the way of an efficient process out of the gate. There were some, and I think very few, but where, kind of revenge and vengeance came into play. I mean, Simons obviously is one of them. You probably know I had 4 bills die on one day, 3 in second reading. There's never been, more than 2 bills I can remember down second reading in a whole session. Never mind 3 on one day, for the same person when, he got a little bit offended, being called out for less than articulate argument on the floor. So, it's a little bit of that, but for the most part, it was. I think they tried their best. It was a very new caucus over there. Like I said, half of it's new. But the problem is, I think that they were trying to deliver on these groups that funded all these campaigns, the unions, the Bloomberg's group on guns and unions and anti business legislation. And a lot of it got through, and got through in a very poor manner as far as how the legislation was written. It's going to have severe repercussions.
Glenn Davis, I tell you what, it has been. It was certainly a breathtaking General Assembly session. But you're right, the Senate acted like the adults in the room, even though it was democratically controlled, and they did act as the backstop, if you will, to some of the more crazy stuff that came out of the House. And but look, I had somebody on the other day and said, will there be a reckoning? Will there be consequences? Probably not, because Virginia is now a very blue state, and so probably there's not going to be any. And 2021 will probably be worse, Glenn.
Yeah, I mean, John, the issue is, so with our firearm legislation, when the Republicans take back the governor, the House, and the Senate, we can change these laws. Now, we have to take back all 3 before we can change any of these laws. But when it happens, we can flip it, and maybe not too much of an impact between now and then. But on this business legislation, I mean, our economy very well could flip upside down, and you can't just change an economy overnight with new laws. And so that's a concern. Last year we were number one in the nation for business and job growth, for business in CNBC polls. I'm willing to bet we're not going to see that this year. And whatever we are this year is going to be worse next year. It's just when you have an area where we're right to work state or an at will state, and now if someone in your company causes drama in your company, and in doing so also goes to an employee and says, I make X number of dollars an hour and you don't, ha ha ha, and all this other stuff, you cannot fire them for telling someone else what they make. Now, in Virginia right now, you can fire someone without cause. Now, business people may not want to do that, but that it's there for them. We passed a number of bills that prevent firing employees on a number of things, and if you're perceived that is the reason you fire them, now you become liable and subject to lawsuit, and the state comes after you. Likewise, there were a number of new employees hired for the Attorney General's office to go after small businesses on classification of employees. And I brought up on the floor, the problem in many cases with classification of employees is the absurd amount of time it takes the IRS to send back a determination letter to an employer when a request for clarification is made on whether an employee should be a contractor or an employee, because it's not a bright line test. And but the Democrats have said, well, no, we're just going to let the Virginia Department of State handle it, and then they're going to proactively go after, and then there's going to be all these additional penalties and interest, and it's crazy. You want to talk about cutting your nose off, spite your face? We're pretty much doing it.
Well, a lot of these Democrats in there on the progressive wing never owned a business, never signed the front of a paycheck. They don't get it. And they just think, small businesses are out to screw people. No, they're out to give people jobs. It's the engine of the economy. But that's kind of some of the moronic things that come out of there. Glenn, I'm almost out of time, but I want to read this text here from Tom in Jacksonville, Florida, who says, once we dole out free money, it takes a huge bureaucracy to monitor it for fraud because there's always qualifications for getting the money, and somebody has to verify it or else massive theft, basically. Messy stuff. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, I mean, I agree with them, but this isn't normal times. I think we all can agree what's going on right now, the impact to our small businesses, which do drive the economy, which are responsible for the overwhelming majority of jobs, we're at a situation where we have to do something. And knowing and having experienced how banks work, knowing the people in our Virginia Small Business Finance Authority and how they run some of the programs they've had in the past, I believe we need quick, efficient rollout of any assistance to these small businesses available. And so that's why I would push rolling this out through them and not taking it out through the private sector.
John Fredericks Radio Network. I want to thank Glenn Davis for being with us.